Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw this yellow Labrador Dexter. Now I did this in Pastels, and as like with all of my pet portraits I like to start off with the eye first. Now for me it's where the soul of that animal is. There's so much expression that we can capture here, so I like to make sure I get this right before I move on to any other element of the portrait. When we're trying to draw eyes and we want to get as much realism in there as we possibly can, we want to try and get that sphere effect of the eye. Now normally there is a darker shadow at the top portion of the eye where they're slightly sunken into the skull. It does cast that shadow, so we want to make sure that we've captured that and really study that reference photo. Now another thing as well is the bright highlight. We want to get that as bright as it needs to be in order to get that contrast in place. Now it's not just the highlight that we need to get really bright for that contrast, it's also the black eyelid and the pupil. We want to make sure that we get that as dark as it needs to be to make this eye look realistic and three-dimensional. For this portrait there was a lot of experimenting on getting the exact colour for my base layer. So I started off using a sanded soft pastel stick method, which did turn out to be my preference throughout the entire portrait here, and then I started using my pastel pencils on top. Now this is a very challenging fur type to capture. The light, subtle cream colours, the various little tonal changes there as well, it can be very complex. So for that reason, I've got a real-time 1-hour tutorial of me working on Dexter over on my Patreon channel. So if you would like to watch that, as I say, all in real time, I'll link that in the description below. I speak about the exact colours that I'm using in order to get this fur type because, as I say, it's all about subtlety, and also I approach this in the reverse as most other fur types that I would draw. So I tackled this from light to dark. The main reason for that is if you go too dark with your base layers with a very subtle colouring like this, we run the risk of creating more muddier layers and we won't be able to get that nice colour and that subtlety that we're after. Now I've already mentioned it a few times, but subtlety I found was the key. All these little changes in the lights and the darks, making sure that I did not go too dark with my base layer was really important for this. And this is one of the main advantages with pastels. They are such a flexible medium to work with. If you need to work from light to dark for something like this, it's so much easier to do that. It's very forgiving. Pastelmat paper is my paper of choice because it does allow for so many layers. You'll see throughout this portrait I've put many layers here, and I still had a lot of tooth of that paper left should I have needed to add more. So I'm using my eye makeup applicators or my soft tools for putting my pigment on my paper here. I didn't use the pan pastels because I actually found for this they were far too pigmented. I love the pan pastels and I don't have the full set, so that could have been why, but I did certainly find that the colours that I had were creating far too much of a yellower colour and just far too rich in general. So I went with more of my muted cream colours with my Rembrandt soft pastel sticks to get my base layer down in this way. You'll see that I haven't put my soft pastel sticks directly to the paper though. That's something that I do find can fill the tooth of that paper really quickly. So my preference, and I talk about this in many of my tutorials on Patreon, is I use a sanded soft pastel stick. So I just sand down some of that on a bit of fine grit sandpaper and apply that pigment directly to my paper with my eye makeup applicators. That allowed me to get this really nice soft base layer that you can see that I put down to start with, and then build up all of my refinement layer with my pastel pencils on top. So if you've seen many of my videos here on YouTube, you'll know that my preference is to work in small areas. Now I find that it really does help to break down that portrait, and I do work a lot more effectively. But if you are someone who likes to work in whole set layers, then there is nothing, there's no right or wrong answer. It's perfectly fine to do that. But I do find that if you are staring at your reference photo and you're not quite sure what you should do next, or you've got an element of that portrait that you're finding particularly challenging, scale it down, work on a couple of square inches or one specific part of that portrait at each time, and then go back to that other element that you're struggling with. I find that if you piece more of that portrait together, it will become far less daunting to tackle. And once I'd got the fur around the eye in place, I found working on the left ear was the next step, and as you can see here now, I'm going to start working on the right eye and then the fur around it. So I do find that also by getting my areas like this about 80-90% complete, I might have a few details I need to add, but getting it up to this standard, I already feel like I've achieved a lot. So I'd be able to look at Dexter even at this point and then look back at my reference photo and see that it already looks like him. Now for me, that means that I'm not working in that ugly stage for far too long, and every portrait goes through that ugly stage. It has to, because it's a layering process. But I do find that if I was to work in individual layers, you do end up with that ugly stage for far too long, and I do find I get a little bit, I'm not as motivated because it doesn't look like that reference photo as quickly as I'd like. So this portion here, you can see that I'm now explaining all the colours that I'm using. This is the portion that's all in real time over on my Patreon channel. I'm explaining why I'm choosing these colours, how I'm going to be layering it, and why I've chosen to layer them in that specific order. Because I did find when working on this fur colouring, even with the same combination of pencils, if you layer them slightly differently, I was getting a different colour and a slightly different tone. So it's really important, I found with this, to once you've got that layer and that order of that layer, I did then sort of maintain that throughout this portrait. The light source was pretty general for this, so there wasn't one light source from one side casting a bright highlight and then a shadow, so I was able to make sure that my layers were uniform throughout. During every base layer stage of all of my portraits, I put a lot of effort into that very first layer. You can see here that before I started using my pencils, it isn't one set colour. So if you were to look at that reference photo now, I'm already identifying where the highlights are, where the shadows are, and I do think that that's really important. The base layer is our foundation for our details, so I do like to make sure that I've got it fairly accurate. When you're working on a short-coated dog like a Labrador, the highlights and the shadows are going to be there for a specific reason. For instance, if you look at his eyebrows and those lighter patches on the top there, that's indicating of where the eye sockets are and the muscular and skeletal structure under the skin. So we have to make sure that we get our highlights and our shadows like this in the right place, because what will happen if they are slightly out, we will then ultimately change the structure of that animal's face. Now that will obviously mean that the end portrait and your finished result won't resemble as closely to that dog as it should. So we want to make sure that we do get those main sets of highlights and shadows close to the reference photo as we can. One of the biggest tips as well is when drawing yellow Labradors is you'll see here that I don't actually use any specific yellow pencils. I'm mainly sticking to my pinks, my really subtle cream colours. There's a couple of fleshier tones there as well, but there are no set yellows. I've even got some subtle browns in there and some yellow ochres to try and bring in some of those warmer colours, especially on the ears where the ears join up to the side of the face. It's the same for if I was drawing blonde hair on a human portrait. There really wouldn't be any actual yellow pencils, so it's something that can be quite deceiving. So if you do have a yellow Labrador on your easel, just be tempted to keep those yellow pencils aside. Don't use them. Use more of, your creams, your yellow ochres, some of those really nice browner colours to get those variations and those tones in place. If we do use yellows, obviously we're going to make it look like a yellow dog, and they're not. They are most of the time this really nice pastel, those pinky colours and some of those creams. If selecting a specific colour and identifying that colour is something that you do find quite challenging, because it can be difficult, an eyedropper tool can be really beneficial. Now you can get them as free apps, or most of the photo editing software will have one, and what it allows you to do is select a part of that reference photo and it will then bring up in a larger box that specific colour that you have pointed at. You will then be able to compare that colour and where it sits on the colour wheel, so you'll then be able to narrow down the pencil choices to actually see, in this case for instance, that it's nowhere near the yellow end of the colour wheel. That can really help to sort of eliminate that process of sit there thinking what colour, what pencil should I pick next. So this is another area here where I decided to do a live voiceover. I haven't yet uploaded this tutorial to Patreon, but it is going to be available very soon. The reason why I decided to do this nose in a real-time clip is because it's a really nice colour. Most of the time the dog studies here on YouTube and on the tutorials are of your normal darker black noses, whereas Dexter had a really nice warm, this pink, this could put Mortem colours, so I wanted to make sure that I did do this as a tutorial as well. Again, as you can see, I really do talk about the colours, why I'm selecting them, the base layers that I'm putting in place and why. For something like this, as you've seen, I've just used my pencils, and that's something else that I do on my Patreon channel. I've got a variety of tutorials where they use pan pastels as your base layer, ones with sanded soft pastel sticks, and some tutorials where I just use the pencils themselves. And here you'll notice that I'm working from dark to light, so I'm working in the reverse of how I'm tackling the fur, but I don't have to worry here about those colours getting too muddy. I want to make sure that I've got those highlights in place, so I'm saving those subtle layers more till my last layers, and I'm building up that wet look, all of that depth in the nostrils. Now in the dog nose study tutorial on Patreon, I really do talk about how to get that 3D effect of the nostrils and how it rolls over to the front surface of the nose. So I speak about this in this tutorial as well, because that is what's going to make the nose realistic. Capturing that shape, putting those highlights in the right place will also get that right shape of the nose from the very beginning. What can happen is if you draw your highlight on the top surface of the nose too high up, you'll make it look like the nose is far too long. So we want to make sure that we've got those highlights in the right place. The contrast is important. You'll see that I've got the nostrils really dark. That's going to indicate obviously that the light is not able to get to that part, but it is got that nice highlight on the left hand side. It's a subtle highlight, it's not overly bright, but it is indicating that the light source is starting to come a little bit more from the left hand side. Now noses, given that they do have that wet look, it can be requiring to use some additional colours where they do reflect some of the surroundings. If you've got a dog that's led on grass, for instance, some of the noses might have a green reflection there, and if you are incorporating the grass in your portrait, those greens within the nose will make a nice addition. That being said, if I do have a portrait where I'm just doing a head and shoulder like Dexter here, I would be tempted to leave out those green tones if you're not drawing the grass, because obviously it will look like then he's got a green nose when it's got nothing to relate to that green tint. So they're just changes and decisions that I will make at the drawing time. For this portrait, as you've seen, I've used a lot of my Caran d'Ache pencils, and I do find that I do get more of those out when I'm tackling a fur type like this. There are a couple of things to bear in mind when you are using those pencils though, and I haven't got the full set because some of the issues that they have. They do sometimes contain these little hard nuggets in the lead that can be really scratchy. They are a real nuisance. The pencils aren't cheap either, and with those additional issues that they do have, I only have a few colours in my set. But when you are using them for details, there are a few things to bear in mind. So really light pressure is key. With any of the pencils that I'm using, I'm not putting too much pressure when I'm getting my fur details in, but more so when I'm using the Caran d'Ache pencils. And that's because they've got a softer lead, so the more pressure that you put on these, you will not only run the risk of breaking the lead, but it's a lot easier to create a thicker line, which when we're trying to draw fur detail like this, as realistic as this, that's obviously not what we want. We want our nice fine lines. So I'll be holding the pencil sort of midway towards the end of the barrel to help create that least pressure on that pencil, and then moving that pencil in the direction that the fur is travelling in. That is also really important, but certainly minimal pressure is the key for the realism in the details. In some instances, I only want that pencil just gliding over that tooth of that paper, just enough for that pigment to be caught on that texture. That can create some really fine details, and I've got a few, I think there's 3 videos on Patreon showing you how I draw the whiskers and creating those really fine lines as well, because in order to get those fine lines there are the same process, so sharp pencils and specifically light pressure. You can also roll these pastel pencils between the fingers to help to create those nice fine lines, and always make sure you're maintaining that sharp point to your pencil. These are all available as real-time clips, so obviously where you're able to see that much slower footage, you're able to see how I'm moving that pencil to get those nice fine details. One thing that I learned from drawing the Dexter here is that this type of fur, they're working in those subtle layers from light to dark, did take an extra 1.5 to 2 days longer to complete this portrait. That wasn't an issue because I had allocated enough time, but it is something to bear in mind when you're working on something like this. I don't know why, maybe it is just that subtlety, making sure that we don't go too dark, having to take that extra time to do that. It does extend that process. And because I knew that it would be really easy to muddy up these colours, I was probably being a little bit more cautious on my base layer stages. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to consider. So because this is a larger area, I've used my oval shaped soft tool. That's my favourite shape that they do. I find that it doesn't create any harsh edges. One thing that I have found using the triangular shape is that when I've used that for my base layer stages, you can end up spinning that sponge round and it can then actually create some really harsh lines. So the oval shape is certainly my preference. They're really nice for getting these base layers nice and soft, really well blended, and at the moment here I'm now doing my layer of refinement. I do this with every single portrait, regardless of any element within that portrait, but I do find that it really does help to smooth out those details when we come to add our additional layers. For me, this layer of refinement makes such a difference from my overall details. The fur that I'm able to create is that much softer because of this extra layer that I put in. And it doesn't take a huge amount of time to add that layer. As you can see here, I'm able to still add my subtle details on top, but by having that refinement layer on top of my very first base layer, my details look lovely and smooth. You can't see that gritty, grainy effect that the Pastelmat can create, and that's because I have added that extra layer of pastel, but I have been cautious not to feel the tooth of the paper. If you find that your pencils are gliding over your surface and the pigment is not catching, it's usually a good indication that you have filled the tooth of the paper. Now, if you've got a decent way through your portrait and you found that that's happened, you can use a workable fixative to apply some of that tooth back to that paper. Now, I don't use any fixatives myself, but I would use a workable fixative if I'd accidentally filled the tooth of the paper in one area. I don't like throwing artwork away, and the workable fixative any fixative will change the colour and the tones of that artwork. That's why I don't like using them as a final fixative, but if you're using them as a workable fixative where you're going to be applying more layers on top, it really doesn't matter about that colour shift because you are going to be adjusting it anyway. But if you are going to use any fixative, I do recommend putting it in a fine mist sprayer bottle because that will help to avoid those heavy droplets that can mark the paper. And also don't spray that fixative too close to your artwork. You want to be a nice decent distance away and work in light but multiple layers of that fixative if you need to, rather than one heavy layer. I did make that mistake one day and put a heavy layer down and my portrait just disappeared. It's almost like it just literally melted within the paper. So I don't use fixatives for that reason. Plus with the colour shift, I always make sure that I've not filled the tooth of the paper, but when you are new to pastels, that can be something that can happen. So a workable fixative certainly does have its place. I find that using pencils can be very much like using a paintbrush. So depending on how much pressure you put on that pencil, where you hold the pencil, how sharp that lead is, many different elements of that can affect the type of pencil stroke that we can create. For the fur here on the neck, I've made sure that I've lengthened my pencil strokes slightly to indicate that difference in fur texture compared to his face. The fur here is that much longer, so I want to make sure that I do lengthen those pencil strokes even if it is by a few millimeters, but I am indicating that there is that difference in texture here. I'm also paying really close attention to that reference photo. There's quite a lot of changes of fur direction here where they've got the folds in the skin. So I want to make sure that I've captured that really, really closely. It's going to be following all that structure underneath that skin. So I really want to make sure that I've got the realism here. Give this part of the portrait as much attention as it needs, just like what we have done with the face. So at the moment here, I was coming up to the last part of this portrait, but I needed to make sure that I had all of this fur finished and completely done, no changes at all, before I went in and added the whiskers. Now the whiskers sit on the top, they're in the front, they overlap everything else, so we want to make sure that they're the very last thing that gets included in the portrait. Of course we can add details in between the whiskers if we need to, but it is going to make our work much more fiddly and obviously just make that process that much longer. So try as best as you can to get these details behind those whiskers in place and finished, and then put your whiskers in at the very end. Some dogs may have whiskers at the side of their face and a couple above their eyes as well, so it's really important to add all of those in if you see them. They're very unique to that animal. And here is Dexter's finished portrait. So I really hope this tutorial was of use. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you want to get notified of future content and the videos that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and I'll be uploading another video here next week. As I've already mentioned, if my Patreon channel and the longer, much slower videos are of use, I'll link my Patreon channel in the description below. I also have a Patreon library on my website, which is also linked below, and that's got all of my tutorials listed there so that you can see the type of content that I've got before you join. As always, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to pop them in the comments below.